We're all probably familiar with pop history notions about Mussolini's Italy. Italy's ineffectiveness in combat, its eventual switching of sides, and the, at times, comedic theatrics of Italian Duce Benito Mussolini. But beyond these common notions about the Kingdom of Italy during the Second World War, Mussolini actually did a lot to change the way Italy worked internally, and more importantly, he was actually one of the most crucial figures in forging the identity of Italy today. Born in 1883 to a blacksmith father and a devout Catholic mother, Mussolini grew up in a modest home, but he was no stranger to politics. His father was a committed socialist and imbued young Benito with radical beliefs about class and economics. By the time Mussolini reached adulthood, he was drawn to the socialist movement himself. He became a fiery journalist and political agitator, advocating for workers' rights and railing against Italy's monarchy. But the First World War would fundamentally change Mussolini, shifting his views away from socialism and towards a new, more nationalistic ideology, fascism. The Great War had ravaged Europe, and Italy, despite being on the winning side, felt cheated by the Treaty of Versailles. Italy's territorial gains were far less than what had been promised. Some Italian nationalists, in particular a poet and Air Force bomber named Gabriele D'Annunzio, dubbed the First World War Italy's mutilated victory. D'Annunzio himself actually went on to act on this, invading the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and establishing the Italian Regency of Carnaro in the city of Fiume, which he claimed was rightfully Italian, but that's a story for another video. Anyway, Mussolini, like many Italians, was angered by this mutilated victory, and his nationalist fervor began to grow. He abandoned the socialist cause, which he now viewed as weak and ineffectual, and instead envisioned a strong, militarized Italy, one that could reclaim its ancient Roman glory. In 1919, Mussolini founded the Fasces of Italian Combat, which eventually transformed into the Fascist Party, a movement promising to restore Italy's pride and crush the growing threat of communism. The early years of the party were very violent. Mussolini's black shirts waged street battles against leftist factions, earning Mussolini a reputation as a man willing to use force to achieve his aims. By 1922, Italy was in chaos, with widespread strikes and protests shaking the fragile liberal government. Sensing his moment, Mussolini led the March on Rome that October. Though the march itself was more bluster than substance, the threat of fascist violence was enough to persuade King Victor Emmanuel III to appoint Mussolini as prime minister, marking the beginning of fascist rule in Italy. Once in power, Mussolini wasted no time consolidating his control. Over the next few years, he dismantled Italy's bureaucratic institutions and created a totalitarian regime with himself at the helm. He styled himself as Il Duce, the boss, who would steer Italy towards its greatness. Mussolini's government focused heavily on propaganda, using it to promote his image as a strongman who could guide the nation to a new era of prosperity. Mussolini's economic policies were rooted in the concept of corporatism. Now, some refer to this system as syndicalism or national syndicalism, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll be using the term corporatism, as it is rooted in the Latin corpus, meaning body. Corporatism was a system based on the model of the human body, where the government, corporations, which were effectively limbs of the state, and labor organizations all collaborated under unified state control to prevent class conflict and manage the economy. Unlike in the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, Mussolini refused to chase after the concept of equality among the classes. While in the Soviet Union the state attempted to redistribute wealth and ensure all classes were equal, and in Nazi Germany the regime dictated that all Germans were inherently equal because of their racial purity and allegiance to the Nazi Party, Mussolini rejected the idea of equality being a virtue entirely. It's difficult to explain, partially because fascism is a somewhat incoherent ideology, but in his own words, fascism affirms the immutable, beneficial, and fruitful inequality of mankind, which can never be permanently leveled through the mere operation of a mechanical process such as universal suffrage. Nonetheless, Mussolini still had the remnants of those socialist sympathies he grew up with. He established labor syndicates to regulate industries and attempted to reduce unemployment through ambitious public works projects such as the draining of the Pontine marshes and the construction of roads, bridges, and railways. These efforts helped create jobs and modernize Italy's infrastructure, portraying Mussolini as a leader who was revitalizing the nation. He did a lot of work to preserve the historical regions of Rome.
If you go along Via dei Fori Imperiali, the avenue which links Piazza Venezia with the Colosseum, you'll see a long string of bronze statues of important Roman emperors, and expansive plazas and walkways surrounding the archaeological digs and tourist attractions. The statues, plazas, and roads themselves were all actually created by Benito Mussolini as public works projects to bring in more jobs, but also to reinforce the idea of Italy being the natural successor to Roman glory. Besides this, Mussolini implemented social welfare programs, including pension systems and subsidized housing, positioning himself as a protector of the working class. He projected an image of being a man of the people, frequently engaging in public displays of hard labor, such as farming or bricklaying, to solidify his persona as a strong, hands-on leader. All of this eventually led to a good deal of media comparison between Mussolini and Franklin Roosevelt, given the similarities between the New Deal and Mussolini's economic agenda. In the 1920s and 1930s, Mussolini actually gained a surprisingly favorable reputation in the West, especially in the United States. Many Americans, especially Italian Americans, admired him for stabilizing Italy after years of post-World War I chaos, and also for curbing communist influence and achieving relative economic progress. His propaganda machine effectively marketed him as a defender of order, industry, and even peace, making Mussolini a respected figure in Western political circles, at least before his later alliance with Hitler tarnished that image. For a time, however, it seemed as though he might be able to align himself with the West. He cultivated economic relationships with the British and Americans in the 1920s and early 30s, but these hopes were soon dashed. Mussolini's aggressive foreign policies, particularly his invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, horrified Britain and France, leading them to impose sanctions against Italy. The French in particular viewed Mussolini's territorial ambitions in Africa and his grand Roman theatrics as a threat to their own colonial holdings, and any chance of a lasting alliance with the West crumbled. At the same time, Mussolini found himself at odds with another rising power in Europe, Germany. Initially, Mussolini saw him as a dangerous upstart who threatened Italy's influence in Central Europe, particularly after the assassination of Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss in 1934. Dollfuss, an Austrian nationalist, anti-Nazi, and ally of Mussolini, had been working to keep Austria independent from Germany, but his murder by Austrian National Socialists signaled Germany's growing influence. Mussolini was outraged by the killing and even sent Italian troops to the Austrian border as a show of force against Hitler's ambitions. For a time, it even seemed like Italy might lead a coalition of smaller European powers like Austria, Hungary, and perhaps even Czechoslovakia against German expansion. However, as the 1930s wore on, the tides began to turn. Isolated from the West due to Ethiopia and with few other allies, Mussolini was gradually pulled into Hitler's orbit. The two dictators met on several occasions, and while Mussolini still harbored reservations about Hitler's racial policies and aggressive expansionism, he also admired the Nazi leader's energy and vision. In 1936, Italy joined Germany in intervening in the Spanish Civil War, cementing a military partnership between the two fascist regimes. By 1939, Mussolini had signed the Pact of Steel, formally allying Italy with Germany. But it was a marriage of convenience, not conviction. As World War II approached, Mussolini found himself torn. His ambitions for a new Roman Empire were grand, but Italy was woefully unprepared for war. Mussolini knew this, but believed that swift victories in North Africa and the Balkans could secure Italy's place as a major power in Europe after the Nazi regime reshaped the West and East. When war broke out, Italy's early campaigns were disasters. In North Africa, the British quickly routed Italian forces, exposing the weaknesses of Mussolini's army. As the war dragged on, Mussolini's gamble proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Germany, frustrated by Italy's failures, was forced to intervene directly in the Mediterranean theater, further sidelining Mussolini's role in the Axis. By 1934, with Italy in ruins and the war turning against the Axis powers, Mussolini's own government turned against him. He was deposed in a coup, arrested, and later rescued by German commandos, only to become a puppet leader of a Nazi-controlled rump state in northern Italy. In 1945, Mussolini's reign ended as violently as it had begun. Captured by Italian partisans while attempting to flee to Switzerland, he was executed and hung in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, as American and British troops marched up the Italian peninsula,
facing little to no resistance. But what if all of that had somehow changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Benito Mussolini's Italy was allowed to join the Western Allies? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help contribute to these scenarios or just have ideas you'd like to have made into videos, consider becoming a channel member or supporting us on Patreon. Thanks, and enjoy the video. At first glance, Mussolini aligning with the Allies seems almost impossible. How could the fiercely nationalist, authoritarian regime of Italy ever find common ground with the democratic powers of Britain and France? At that time, the industrial states, most of whom we might consider the Allies, controlled more than 43 million square miles, or 84.4% of the Earth's surface, while Italy was the most overpopulated nation in Europe compared to the size of its landmass, and largely agrarian. Without resources and burdened by a population that exceeded the support capacity of the soil and generating a fraction of the per capita income of the advanced industrial nations, Italy had been a marginal country that, for centuries, had been subject to the occupation and control of others. Even before his ascension to power, Mussolini was well aware of this fact. He claimed that the political independence of a nation is a direct function of its economic independence. Without such economic independence, Italians would, as he put it, remain slaves. Essentially, Mussolini's argument was that the Italian people were hostages to those who provided them coal, grain, and that which they needed for their industrial hubs in the north to function. Mussolini thus called for rapid industrialization, a program that would occupy the Italians for decades, in order that Italy might develop the capabilities necessary to attempt this restoration of the Roman Empire. Until the war, Mussolini had attempted to cooperate with the industrial powers of Western Europe in the construction of a four-power pact that might stabilize the increasingly uncertain political future of Europe and provide Italy with a basis to develop its economy. At the time, Mussolini still entertained grave fears concerning the rise of German military power in Central Europe. The problem was that, in general, neither the British nor the French seemed prepared to act decisively in the face of increasing German provocation. The British and French continued appeasement even after they cut ties with Italy, and didn't see it necessary to align with the Italians against Germany, and again were skeptical of Italy, especially because of its involvement in Ethiopia. So in order to make this possible, we'll need to change a few things about the build-up to the Second World War. First of all, the assassination of Dollfuss in Austria will have to shake Mussolini to his core. After all, Mussolini, in our own history, greatly objected to Germany's aggressive moves with regard to Austria. Mussolini had envisioned a partnership with Austria's Engelbert Dollfuss, a fellow authoritarian who shared Italy's interests in countering German expansion. So if we assume that Mussolini perhaps sees the writing on the wall in terms of the Anschluss's inevitability, and fears that Germany has orchestrated regime change in Austria, it's not out of the question to assume he may delay or even cancel his plans in Ethiopia in order to pivot to the British and the French. The best time for such a pivot to happen would be in the 1930s, as the leaders of Britain, France, and Italy had gathered in the lakeside town of Stresa in northern Italy. On April 14, 1935, it was here that the Stresa Front was born, a coalition meant to enforce the Treaty of Versailles against Hitler's Germany. Now, miscommunications between the Allies left Italy with the impression that it had free rein in Ethiopia, leading to the Abyssinia crisis in our own timeline, and the signing of the Anglo-German naval agreement just months later, which shattered Mussolini's trust and left the Stresa Front effectively dismantled before it could come to metamorphose into a more solid economic or military agreement. But this time, without such a crisis, and with Mussolini more prepared to do whatever it takes to halt Germany's encroachment, the Stresa Front will survive, and in fact transform into an economic agreement to mutually develop the French, British, and Italian industrial and military sectors. Mussolini would, as a result of these new friends, become increasingly outwardly critical of the Anschluss of 1938. In 1934, Italy had, again, made an agreement with Austria that would protect the nation from outside aggression. So Mussolini would probably move even more troops than in our own timeline to his border with Austria in that same show of force, and condemn Germany's annexation at every possible opportunity. The fortified Alpine Wall, which was originally built to protect Italy from a potential French invasion,
would now be redirected to the German-Italian border following the Anschluss, as Italy finds itself directly in the line of potential fire, with Germany to the north and the looming possibility of a wider European war. The rest of the build-up to the Second World War would likely follow the same course of action. The Sudetenland would be annexed by Germany, leaving a rump state in Czechia and Slovakia. The German-Soviet non-aggression pact would be signed, and as Hitler provokes Britain and France over Poland, war would break out. Germany's blitzkrieg would still quickly shatter France in the lowlands, but rather than the rapid collapse and surrender of the French state, the French government would make a fighting retreat into Italy. The once foreseen fall of Paris would not signal the end for the French. Instead, the government would re-establish itself in exile in Rome under the protection of Mussolini's government, refusing to bow to the Nazis. As a new British expeditionary force would be assembled and routed to Milan, the Italians would occupy Corsica with British support, attempting to create a buffer between Germany and North Africa. The logical next question then arises: will Hitler's Germany invade Italy? The Alps had once been the site of brutal, stagnant warfare during World War I, and Germany was well aware of Italy's poor performance in that mountainous terrain against Austria-Hungary. Yet this time the situation was a bit different. While the Nazis had conquered much of Western Europe with their devastating blitzkrieg tactics, the rugged snow-covered peaks of the Alpine frontier presented an altogether different challenge. Blitzkrieg, which relied on speed, mobility, and surprise, was poorly suited for the steep, narrow passes of the Alps, where heavy tanks and fast-moving infantry would struggle against Italy's defensive positions. Germany could either try to replicate Austria-Hungary's slow, grinding warfare from the last war, or shift its focus to large-scale bombing campaigns aimed at Italy's northern industrial centers like Milan, Turin, and Venice. This strategy, however, would stretch Germany's already thin air force, diverting critical resources from their ongoing bombing campaign against Britain. If Hitler ordered an Alpine invasion, the initial gains might be swift. The Italian forces, somewhat unprepared and with relatively young defenses in the only 6-some-year-old Alpine wall, would likely fall back under the initial pressure. Yet Italy and Britain would have the advantage of time to regroup, fortify positions in northern Italy's cities, and rebuild their defenses. Cities like Bergamo and Milan could serve as rallying points, with Italy taking in, constructing fortifications, and holding Germany back in the mountains as German supply lines are stretched, making it difficult for Hitler's war machine to maintain momentum. But in actuality, I believe that Hitler wouldn't even attempt such a logistically challenging invasion of Italy at all. Hitler's personal ambitions following the fall of France were almost always directed eastward. His true prize was the Soviet Union and the vast lands of Eastern Europe, rich in resources and Lebensraum, or living space. It's likely that Operation Barbarossa, his long-planned invasion of the Soviet Union, would simply be his next move after a period of regrouping and reorganization following the Western campaign in France. So for the sake of this scenario, let's simply assume that the war turns eastward and Italy is left shaken and on edge for the time being, but not yet invaded. Now, an important thing to note before we continue is that, regardless of whether or not Germany launches an invasion of Italy, Germany would be at a slight economic disadvantage following the fall of France, which may have an effect on Barbarossa. In our own history, Italy's Mediterranean position was crucial for maintaining German access to the sea and for supporting the campaigns in North Africa. Without Italy, Germany would have basically no hold on the Mediterranean. And what's more likely is that the British and Italians would maintain total control over the region, and the North African campaigns, should they happen at all, which I don't believe is possible, would probably end in Allied victories, without the Italian boot to provide the Germans a direct bridge to Tunisia. Additionally, northern Italy's industry, while of course dwarfed by Germany's, still provided a significant contribution to the Axis war machine in our own timeline. Losing access to Italian factories, workers, and raw materials could force Germany into a slightly more precarious economic position as the war drags on. And it also means Germany is ever so slightly more confined to the European continent, without access to its colonial resources in Africa and the Pacific. As historian Timothy Saxon noted, Italy occupied a central place in Allied strategy after the May 1943 defeat of Axis forces in Tunisia. Removing Fascist Italy from Germany's side would eliminate the only power directly supporting the German war effort, with a significant number of troops in the European theater. Without Italy's presence, not only would German forces be stretched a bit thinner, but it could also undermine the participation of smaller Axis allies like Hungary and Romania, who might see Germany as a slightly weakened partner. Even Spain and Switzerland, whose economic and diplomatic ties to Germany had remained neutral but supportive, could reconsider their positions if Italy stood with the Allies. Now, of course, none of this is guaranteed, but it is likely to have an effect on the German High Command strategy, perhaps leading them to make less ambitious and more cautious movements with regard to the Balkans and Eastern Europe. But at the same time, without German forces having to be sent to Egypt or Greece, I believe any faults maybe could be balanced out by forces that would otherwise be wasted in the Mediterranean. But with the question of an invasion of Italy answered, the next major question really becomes, will Germany invade Yugoslavia? In our history, Hitler's invasion of Yugoslavia was actually driven not by his alliance with Mussolini, but by the need to quell an anti-Axis coup against the monarchist government of Yugoslavia, and secondarily to secure support for the Croatian fascist movement. Despite Mussolini's and other Italian irredentist ambitions in Dalmatia, Germany actually acted primarily in its own interests when they supported Italian campaigns in the Balkans in World War II. In this alternate timeline, we can assume that even with Italy now aligned with the Western Allies, Germany's invasion of Yugoslavia would proceed as it did in our own timeline, creating a new front that would decisively now draw Italy into the fray on the defensive. As the Germans were fighting through Yugoslavia, they would likely besiege Trieste and the port city of Fiume, and Italy, despite its newfound alliances, would undoubtedly struggle to hold its position. If, at the same time, Germany decides to open a front along the Franco-Italian border, northern Italy would face a dual threat, one that could spell disaster for the region, putting immense pressure on Mussolini and his government. In response, Mussolini's propaganda machine would shift into overdrive. Il Duce, always keen to fashion himself as a modern Caesar, would frame the German invasion as nothing less than a battle for the survival of Italy itself, invoking memories of the Roman Empire's battles against the barbarian tribes of ancient Germania. However, all hope for Italy is not yet lost. In fact, the timing of this invasion might be the very nail in the coffin for Germany's war. By December of that year, the United States would have entered the war in Europe, bringing with it not only the immense industrial power of the American war machine, but also the manpower and military expertise needed to turn the tide. With the British already engaged in the Mediterranean and the Americans now fully involved, Italy would transform into a staging ground for the Allies. Roosevelt would flood Mussolini's forces with weapons, supplies, and reinforcements, making it possible for Italy to hold the line in the north and even begin pushing back against German advances. The strategic value of the Italian peninsula in this timeline would prove far greater than it had in our own. Italian airfields still intact would give the British and American bombers unprecedented access to targets deep within Axis-held Europe. The bombers could strike industrial and logistical centers in Germany, Austria, and even Hungary and Romania. Railroads, bridges, oil refineries, and factories would be targeted, crippling Germany's war economy far earlier than in our own timeline. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union, buoyed by American Lend-Lease support, would continue its relentless push westward. Germany, now fighting on multiple fronts, would find itself greatly overstretched, up to 2 years earlier than in our own history. As the Italians, British, and Americans drive northward, they would also begin planning operations to liberate southeastern France. The Allies would coordinate with the French rebels and nationalists to break German control in southern France, and with a likely D-Day-esque invasion from the north and Soviet advances from the east, it wouldn't be looking good for the Germans. One interesting effect of these changes, though, perhaps not the most likely outcome, could be that the Western Allies might reach Berlin before the Soviets, preventing a partition of Germany and the rise of communist influence in the heart of Europe. The first question to address is why the Allies did not attempt to seize Berlin in the actual timeline. Author and historian Wes Frank argued that the United States Ninth Army could have taken Berlin with little opposition on their side of the city, but Eisenhower refrained from pushing forward. The reason? Political pragmatism. By April 1945, the division of Germany had already been negotiated in broad terms, and Berlin had fallen into the Soviet sphere of influence, according to the Allied occupation zones agreed upon months earlier during the London Protocol, and later solidified at Yalta. However, with Italy in the picture, and also with all that's occurring about 2 years earlier than in our own history, it's quite possible that a division of Germany would never have been solidified. After all, Stalin himself changed the deal on multiple occasions, And it's not at all out of the question that the Allies could certainly have done this too, especially since FDR is still around and hasn't passed away yet. Franklin Roosevelt had his own vision for a division of Germany. He wanted to divide the state into a series of liberal conservative states that would align themselves with the West, not ceding any ground to the Soviets. With Italy providing a gateway to Vienna and even Prague, I would argue that it's feasible that the theoretical Iron Curtain's borders could be pushed back, perhaps even to Slovakia after the war, as the Soviets would simply have less influence at the negotiation table. In addition, Mussolini himself would have a likewise disproportionately large amount of influence given simply how crucial Italy was to the Allied victory. Now there certainly are counterarguments against this, the greatest of which being that the so-called race to Berlin didn't really exist at all. The Allies' focus was primarily on defeating the German war machine and capturing the Ruhr industrial basin, and the Allies were less interested in symbolic victories like capturing Berlin than the Soviets were. But again, Wes Frank's assertion regarding the April 12, 1945 date basically insinuates that if we give the Allies even a marginal amount of time in advance to achieve their priorities in defeating Germany before the Red Army launches its offensive, that Berlin would possibly fall to the Western Allies. If we go off of such an assumption, the extra 20-some months this alternate scenario gives us means it's quite reasonable to state that the Allies could take Berlin. So let's jump on this train of thought and say, for the sake of the scenario, that Germany falls in 1943 and the Allies and Soviets draw their lines of influence much further east than in our own timeline. Germany would likely be divided according to the Roosevelt plan, perhaps with minor modifications based on British and French input. We can also assume, given an Allied push a little further eastwards to Vienna or Prague, that Czechia would become a Western Allied government, as would Austria. Yugoslavia may end up split along ethno-linguistic borders, although without Truman's self-determinism, this is a bit of a wild card, especially given the Croatians' actions during the war. What is likely, however, is Italian control of at least northern Dalmatia, and significant Italian influence over the Western Balkans. Building off of this, one of the most intriguing results of this scenario will be the post-war ideological landscape of Europe. Fascism, as embodied by Mussolini, would be spared the same level of condemnation that befell National Socialism in Germany. In this new reality, fascism and National Socialism would be seen as distinct ideologies by Western, particularly American, historians, political thinkers, and propagandists. While both were authoritarian and nationalistic, Mussolini's fascism would be framed as an economic and governmental structure for a state and a partner, much like the monarchies of the First World War, to the Western democratic nations and their common cause against the greater threat, Hitler's Nazism, and in the years to follow, Stalin's Soviet communism. National Socialism and Stalinism may even be painted as two sides of the same coin, and perhaps even essentially be grouped into the same ideological umbrella by Cold War propaganda, portraying the Soviets as the new Nazis. Anyway, beyond the ideological lens, Mussolini would likely view American aid by way of the Marshall Plan with a little bit of suspicion, rejecting certain elements out of national pride, and partially because Italy would not have suffered as greatly as some of the other war-ravaged countries, given that the war never penetrated too deeply into Italian territory. Nonetheless, Mussolini would still cooperate with the Americans and accept their help to rebuild parts of the North. It's difficult to say whether Italy would simply drift away from the Allied bloc and form a third faction in the Cold War, or just marginally reform and remain an active partner of the Western Alliance, and perhaps even democratize after the death of Mussolini, just as it happened in Spain after the death of Franco. It's a question that we likely will never have an answer to, but one thing will remain certain. Italy, as an idea, will remain forever marked by the Second World War, and the victory, ironic as it may seem, of fascism over Nazism. But let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you really liked hearing about the Second World War. You can support us on Patreon by following the link in the description, or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.